All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Minal Patel Davis. I serve as Special Advisor to Mayor Turner on human trafficking. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's event. There are about 45 corporations represented here with influencers from procurement, supply chain, logistics, compliance, corporate social responsibility, legal and safety from the oil and gas, medical, financial, legal, and lodging industries. So this is the exact audience that we were looking for tonight, and so we're just thrilled that you all have made the time to come. We also have representation from academia and from several of the city's nonprofit partners who assist the mayor's office in the execution of the city's overall plan to combat trafficking. So tonight I have the honor and the privilege of introducing Mayor Sylvester Turner. Mayor Turner's commitment to fighting human trafficking is part of his much larger commitment to make Houston a city where all can thrive. While he addresses common big city issues successfully time and time again, he's also managed to empower the first human trafficking office and a United States Mayor's office in the U.S., not only through opening doors for us to discuss our approach with mayors across the country, through the United States Conference of Mayors, not just one time, but 3 times. So we're just so thrilled about his leadership around this issue. He's also recognized the value for this needs-based approach, and he's also approved multiple trips and digital video conference calls at the request of the Department of State to take our unique needs-based municipal response to trafficking around the country and the globe. So I'm going to ask our panelists to join us from backstage here in a second. And I'm going to ask all of us to join me in welcoming my fantastic boss, Mayor Sylvester Turner.
Let me start off by thanking all of you for being here, and I certainly want to thank Minal Patel Davis for giving leadership to this panel discussion tonight. So thank you, Minal. And before I make any additional comments, let me just say I'm so proud of Minal because recently she received the Presidential Award dealing with human trafficking. So I want to acknowledge her, and I want to acknowledge her team. She has an outstanding team. And give it up to the team. So the city of Houston is benefiting from their collective efforts, and I very much appreciate it. I certainly want to welcome everyone to tonight's event. I'd like to recognize members of the Consular community, the Governor's Office, council members, and I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Jones Day Foundation and Houston First. Please give it up to all of them. Houston is leading the way among U.S. cities on the issue of labor trafficking, and I am proud to host what I know is going to be a thought-provoking event this evening. Hurricane Harvey, seemed like it was only yesterday, while devastating, presented an opportunity to develop the first municipal trafficking disaster response. The city's many programs have several layers that are part of that continuum, and our Harvey trafficking response was no exception. After Harvey, the mayor's office worked diligently to mitigate the human rights violations and legal precedents that arose after Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And the most egregious post-Katrina precedent involved Indian nationals that were trafficked to help rebuild oil and gas assets in violation of these laws. The Cigna case made national and international headlines in media outlets like the Wall Street Journal, documenting the various abuses faced by those victimized by Cigna and its subcontractors. Mr. Ebi Raju is a welding inspector and was a Cigna case worker, and you will hear from him tonight. And thank you for being here, Mr. Raju. Your input will be invaluable to this discussion. Equipped with this post-Katrina information, I signed Executive Order 156, Zero Tolerance for Trafficking in the City's Purchasing and Service Contracts. This executive order now becomes a part of every city contract. One example is our $250 million municipal bond deal for airport expansion. This means we're using our collective power to push the envelope with institutions like Merrill Lynch and Bankers Trust. This 5-page executive order was also covered in a 6-page article published in Bloomberg's Law White Collar Crime Report, stating that Houston was on the compliance vanguard. We often discuss with executive order this with our corporate risk mitigation presentations to make sure that corporations understand how we want to lead by example. We also want to lead by example by hosting this event tonight. We will hear from panelists comprised of a long-time expert and senior official at the U.S. Department of State, an industry expert taking concrete steps to address supply chain issues from Marriott, a compliance and social auditing firm executive from Verite, a managing director for the Freedom Fund, a global fund to combat trafficking based on hotspots model, and the CEO of Stardust Fund and Family Philanthropic Office. Also, we are honored to have Amy, Shawn, Amol, and Kyle with us tonight. Tonight's audience is composed of a broad-based spectrum of leaders from private industry with local, regional, and global footprints. Each of you plays an indispensable role in transforming Houston into a conscientious city. We know your context. Sometimes you and your subcontractors encounter local customs and mindsets that may perpetuate forced labor and trafficking. We need proactive and responsible actors that can leverage the power in their supply chains to help the local economies they operate in to thrive. And in the last month, there have been 4 major announcements or events on this specific topic. The Concordia annual summit in the United Nations General Assembly met in New York. The Responsible Business Alliance is meeting in California. And the CEO Guide to Labor Trafficking and Supply Chains was released earlier this month. This is indicative of a global trend we want our corporate community to be ahead of, especially given the heightened post-disaster risk. Tonight, I encourage the corporations here to consider the tools and strategies discussed to do what is right not only in Houston, but throughout the country and world. And I encourage the consular offices to continue to advocate anti-trafficking messages through their home bases. In closing, I am confident that my office is doing all that we can do to ensure that Houston's post-Harvey response will stand the test of time and will not yield post-Katrina-like legal precedents. That includes you as important partners in the business, consular, medical, academic, and nonprofit community. Again, Minal, let me thank you for the leadership that you have demonstrated. Let me thank you, the staff, a very high-paying staff. I meant that as a joke. But they work because they are committed and they're dedicated to the city of Houston, as all of you. So please enjoy this discussion, and I know it will be highly invigorating tonight. Thank you.
All right, so it's time for the moderated event. I think that means I won't be getting a raise anytime soon, is what I read. So let's start with Amy O'Neill Richard, who's with us from the Department of State. Amy, why don't you take a couple of minutes to introduce your work and what the DOS does when it comes to this topic.
Good evening. Thank you, Mayor Turner and Presidential Award winner, Minal, for hosting this forum and really raising the bar on the anti-trafficking work. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was really pleased to present you with the highest award the U.S. government gives out for your anti-trafficking work. I'd also like to say that we've been so pleased the city of Houston has really been proactive, and we recognize and appreciate that you're willing to share your model with other municipalities. We love to see promising practices exported. So thank you all, too, for coming to join us tonight to learn a little bit more about our work. The State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons was stood up pursuant to the U.S.'s anti-trafficking law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, essentially to do two things. One, to lead the U.S. global engagement on human trafficking, and two, to manage the coordination of federal efforts to combat human trafficking. Good news. Today, literally today, we have a newly confirmed ambassador, John Richmond, who is starting with our office back in D.C., so we're excited about that. But in short, at the State Department, we engage bilaterally and multilaterally to better prevent human trafficking, protect victims, prosecute traffickers, strengthen partnerships, and share promising practices. We're probably best known for the production of our annual Trafficking in Persons report. In short, the TIP report is our leading diplomatic and diagnostic tool to guide our relations with foreign governments on the TIP report. We also fund approximately $65 million in foreign assistance for 91 projects in 76 countries. Finally, we engage civil society and the private sector with a goal towards leveraging resources and expertise on behalf of this issue. So thanks again for coming.
Yeah, next, I'd love to hear from two from Marriott.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Mayor Turner and, of course, to Ms. Minal Davis for putting on this event, as well as the rest of the amazing staff at the Mayor's office. My name is Rinsche, and I'm going to be providing kind of the business perspective on this issue and how companies, in particular Marriott, as well as for my previous experience with Disney, how human rights impact business. I specialize in helping companies understand their human rights impacts and identifying solutions that will allow companies to make a positive impact in addressing these types of issues. So in my current role at Marriott, I lead business and human rights. Marriott International, hopefully that is a familiar name. We are a global lodging hotel company with 6,700 properties around the world across 30 different unique brands. So you may have heard of the St. Regis, or Ritz-Carlton, Courtyard, Autograph Collection, Marriott Namesake. So lots of different types of brands underneath the Marriott portfolio. On human rights issues, and in particular on human trafficking, the hospitality industry has kind of a unique challenge in that there are two very different issues that impact the sector or the industry. One is sex trafficking, and the other is labor trafficking. Unfortunately, these are issues that where perpetrators or human traffickers may exploit hotels for various purposes and criminal types of activities. So at Marriott International, we have taken a holistic approach in addressing human trafficking, both of sex trafficking and forced labor. We have implemented a four-pronged strategy that focuses on policy enhancements, so looking at our existing policies and seeing whether or not and how we can enhance or integrate human rights criteria as part of that policy. So in 2006, Marriott has had a long-time human rights policy. However, in 2017, we had the opportunity to update this outdated policy to actually specify ethical recruitment and the company's position and stance on a no-fees policy, meaning that Marriott International does not charge recruitment fees as part of the application process. Secondly, we also specified human trafficking and forced labor as part of our human rights policy. And then we thought, okay, great. We as a company have great policies in place, and many of you who are on the corporate side may have great policies as well. But if our own employees or associates don't understand what the human rights issues are within our human rights policies, how can they be great champions of our work? So the second step that we did and focused on is really around awareness raising and education. So what we decided to do was created a human trafficking awareness program in partnership with ECPAT USA and Polaris, two anti-leading organizations around the trafficking space. And this is really for employee engagement. In 2017, Marriott International mandated human trafficking awareness training for all on-property associates across both managed and franchised properties around the world. This means that we are potentially positively impacting and educating 700,000 associates who wear the Marriott name badge. That means 700,000 more eyes who are more aware of what human trafficking is and can actually identify and report and potentially prevent it. I'm very, very pleased and honored to share that we've already trained 500,000 people within 21 months. What's more remarkable is that within the first 3 months of our mandating human trafficking awareness training, we had 2 situations, one here in the US and one in Canada, where associates, their regular job is housekeeping or lobby, etc. Because they took the training, we had 2 children saved from being trafficked in the hotels. And what is even more remarkable is that our CEO and president, Arne Sorensen, wrote a blog for USA Today early this year where he led the story, not talking about our policies or all the great things that we're doing, but he led the story talking about the associate who accurately and appropriately identified human trafficking and was able to save a 12-year-old boy in New Orleans who had been missing for 3 days and was safely reunited back with his family with the help of law enforcement. So these are real things that are happening, where when empowering our associates or employees, they have the ability to be able to take positive action and can lead to saving lives. I mean, that's not our intent, but we have seen direct impact of this. We're doing a better job of trying to track these types of cases, but a few months ago, there was another case, actually in London, where a lobby attendant and in a very, very busy hotel near a train station, again, this associate took the training and knew the indicators for human trafficking and was able to save a 16-year-old girl from being sex trafficked in our lobby by a perpetrator who had just been released from prison. So that perpetrator is back in prison again, and this is a result of the bravery of hotel employees knowing what to look out for. So that's the second area that we're working on. And one of the things that we wanted to do was, creating these types of materials takes a lot of resources and time. So we decided as a company to donate our human trafficking awareness training program to the American Hotel and Lodging Association, so that other hotel companies out there can use this training and leverage it for their own hotel employees. And we know that over a dozen different hotel companies have done so. The cost for this training, there is a cost for our hotels, and it's essentially a fundraiser. So they purchase the training, but those fees go back to Polaris and ECPAT to further support their programming. The third area that we're working on is around operations, and this is really kind of the bulk of what I'll be sharing my insights on, is that how these issues also impact a hotel company from a very external-facing, public-facing issue, but also inside the company from the supply chain aspect. And then fourthly, which I think is critical as part of the equation and part of the solution, is really around partnership, external partnership. So many of the groups up here are great partners on this issue, and we have actually launched last week announced a partnership with Polaris where we're going to be rolling out human trafficking awareness posters for hotels across the US. So this will be coming out next year. One of the other partnerships that we have is with the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. Looking beyond training, what else can a hotel company do? And one of the things that we're really good at is we're an employer. We hire a lot of people, and there's a lot of people who work in hotels. So we partnered with the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery to create a market-based skills and training employability program to help victim survivors of human trafficking get back on their feet. So one of the things that we hope to do is we're creating a curriculum right now to provide that training for victim survivors that's going to be launched next March and will be publicly available. It will be open source, so any service provider who helps and engages with victim survivors can actually implement the training on their own. And wherever we have hotels, we will provide volunteers from our Human Resources Department to co-facilitate those trainings in partnership with those service providers. So that's kind of the way that we're looking at this, is really through a holistic picture at both sex trafficking as well as forced labor.
Okay, Shawn Macdonald from Verite, we'll go with you next.
Yes, thanks, Minal. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Shawn Macdonald. I'm the CEO of Verite, which is a nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts. Don't blame me for the Red Sox. Sorry about that with the Astros. but we're active around the world. Our emphasis is on helping companies deal with supply chain labor problems, including human trafficking. So we work closely with companies to do special assessments on human trafficking risk or other labor issues, training and capacity building, whether it's directly for their employees, kind of like the kind of trainings that Tu was mentioning, as well as ways to build the capacity of their suppliers to meet the growing list of social and environmental obligations that many companies are expecting of their global supply chains. We also do a lot of research and tool building. We take a lot of the insights we learn from working directly with companies around the world across a wide variety of sectors: agriculture, electronics, construction, fast-moving consumer goods, and make those available through public tools like the responsiblesourcingtool.org that we did in partnership with the State Department. Amy can do a little product plug there. And our overall goal is to find the best ways to help companies deal pragmatically with labor vulnerabilities in their global chains, but then also to connect the dots with public policy figures, other civil society organizations, worker organizations directly to have win-win solutions. And so I'm really eager to talk more to this panel on some of the work that we've done. Thanks for inviting me.
Great, thanks. Amol Mehra from the Freedom Fund.
Sure, thank you. I'll also add my thanks to the organizers and the mayor for really leading at the city level an effort to address modern slavery. My name is Amol, and I come to you all from the Freedom Fund. We are a global leader in the fight to end modern slavery. We work across three main sets of interventions. We fund frontline organizations in regions of the world where there's a high prevalence of slavery. And we count all forms of slavery, which includes forced labor, trafficking, bonded labor, sex trafficking, etc. We also work through global initiatives, and these are cross-cutting thematic or strategies where we invest in efforts that help scale solutions and share solutions down to our frontline partners. These include things like supply chains, legal portfolio that I help manage, mental health and trauma, as well as responsible and ethical migration. And the final set of interventions that we are building out is a movement building portfolio. And what we're doing here is creating a cadre of what we call freedom leaders. And these are frontline leaders that we're capacitating and supporting to help build the movement to end modern slavery at the very local grassroots level. So I'll leave my introduction there, but thanks again for the invitation.
Great, and we'll end with the intros with Kyle Wright, the CEO of the Stardust Fund.
Good evening, and I also want to add my thanks to Minal and the mayor. Being the sole Houstonian up here, really a sense of pride, with what our city is doing, but also that experts like these fine people see value in coming to our community to talk about this issue. So thank you as well for joining us. I have the privilege, really, of overseeing a philanthropic and investment portfolio for a family. Our philanthropic work has primarily been focused for several years on trafficking and forced labor in Houston, nationally and internationally. We're actually an anchor donor in the Freedom Fund, and that's where we started to understand at a deeper level by actually going on some of the field visits with the Freedom Fund how connected this issue was to our work beyond the philanthropic side. And so starting to understand the investment connection to this work. And for us, we started thinking about, if this is really our philanthropic work, if it's really about impact, and it's beyond generosity, then we can do more. And so we started to ask questions and try to understand what our exposure might be to trafficking and forced labor. And I'll share a bit more on that journey tonight. But essentially, we've worked over the last few years to align our portfolio, activate our investment portfolio around this issue. And for us, it's started as kind of a value alignment thing and understanding the risk that's there in the portfolio. Is shifting to understanding how capital can actually be used to change this issue as well as a tool for change. And working with groups like this have really helped us understand that power and leverage.
Okay, great. So that's introductions of everyone that's in your program. So for their full bios, be sure to refer to that because they're super accomplished folks. So it's an honor to have you here again. And Amy, I'll start with you about if you can help set the stage for tonight's conversation, that'd be great. So if you can talk about what the scale of human trafficking is globally and the profits, and also if you can help just put the labor trafficking issue when it comes to supply chains into a greater context for all of us to understand, that would be great.
So we know that human trafficking occurs in virtually every country. And last year, the International Labor Organization released some global statistics. They found that nearly 25 million people were trapped in forced labor, with 16 million of that number exploited in the private sector. The ILO also has estimated that the profits made from human trafficking are approximately $150 billion a year, so extraordinarily profitable. The tip office at the State Department, we know from well over a decade and a half of work that human trafficking impacts men and women and children and transgender individuals, that the primary forms of human trafficking include sex trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, domestic servitude, forced child labor, and the unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers. We know that human trafficking can be found in virtually every sector. Research by our colleagues at Verite highlighted particular concerns with human trafficking in the agricultural, construction, electronics, extractives, mining and metal, fishing and aquaculture, forestry, healthcare, hospitality, housekeeping, textile and apparel, and transportation and warehousing sectors. We know that the risk tends to be more pronounced in those industries that rely on low-skilled or unskilled labor, and where the labor is drawn from more vulnerable populations such as migrants, domestic workers, or fishers, or the homeless. So basically, the problem is enormous, the profits are enormous, and we know that it's impacting all sectors, which is why we, I think, are all here tonight to learn more.
Great, thank you. And so, Shawn, if you can help draw the connection between trafficking and the supply chain using an oil and gas scenario, that would be super helpful, I think, for the audience, considering the composition.
Yes, and I think I'll give you some examples from some work that we've done with a couple of oil and gas companies, but I think some of these lessons are applicable across a lot of different sectors, because essentially, when you look at the full product life cycle or service life cycle with a company like an oil and gas company, you'll see that there are risks of human trafficking in the exploration stage. A lot of places where there isn't a good, strong rule of law, and where a lot of the work is difficult and dangerous and remote, is kind of work that can be very difficult to recruit people. So sometimes people have to resort to various kinds of force, fraud, and coercion to get people to that site. And so we've been able to help a lot of oil and gas companies understand the risk of trafficking and exploration, but then also in the drilling and the processing that happens, because so much of oil and gas extraction is happening in countries that rely a lot on migrant labor. And as some of the people have already mentioned, most companies, regardless of what sector you're in, the labor trafficking risk for a company comes through the migrant labor, because so many migrant workers are exploited, having to pay for jobs, or they are trapped in isolated circumstances. And so we were able to work with a number of oil and gas companies to understand how even some of their more highly skilled positions, particularly in the Gulf, where there are recruited workers from across the world, were facing some difficult circumstances. I think another thing that was really important for the oil and gas sector is that some of the services that are associated with exploitation of these resources, like the housing for the workers, the transportation, the food service, things like that, relied on outsourced labor provision. And that's where there was a lot of risk of human trafficking. And the companies didn't even realize it because they thought that was something that we outsourced. And there may be several layers of outsourcing contractual arrangements that are happening that are now exposing those companies to trafficking risks, especially now that there's a lot more media attention and a lot more regulatory attention on trafficking. It's also interesting to see that some oil and gas companies have also been looking at their retail outlets in the US and around the world, not just providing fuel but selling other things. And those, because of franchise or licensing arrangements, there's also exposure for a company there, but there's not a lot of visibility and not as much accountability as there should be for the people who are operating or hiring labor in those facilities. So I think the overall important message that I want to send is when you're looking at your full supply chain, it's not just necessarily the hot spots where you think, in some parts of Africa or Asia where there may be some problems, but even in the greater Houston area, perhaps based on where the labor source is coming, and to really pay a lot of attention to the full nature of your supply chain, and especially to the outsourced labor providers.
Great. And Amol, if you can help us understand how the risks are often identified and can come to light.
Sure. Maybe I'll start by saying how the risks are often identified, and then I'll sort of migrate into how the ideal way, some of the ideal ways that they could be identified. I think that there is a particular moment right now with this alchemy of media, pressure, labor organizations working on this issue, civil society really taking up this issue in a more meaningful way, and then really some proactive companies like Marriott, and then investors too, which hopefully Kyle can build up on as well. This is all coming together to focus on trafficking as really as a solvable human rights challenge. And I think that is something really unique to this moment. And it's the orchestration of all of those efforts that have led to it. So I think the thing is that you're starting to see companies engage in more enhanced due diligence down their supply chains and through their business relationships to detect where there are potential violations. And that's really great and is commendable, and I think we need to see more of that. But I think one of the pieces where I think that has been less developed, and I think we need to see more of it as well, is around how companies engage with their workers, and workers deep within their supply chain. The global nature of our economy means that work is more fragmented and fractured than ever. So if you look at an apparel supply chain or even manufacturing supply chain, the engagement that a multinational has from, let's say, the Houston office to a production facility is so attenuated, but that's actually where the most valuable information and the risk lies. So I think what we're hoping to see definitely with the Freedom Fund and how we work is to see more linkages between workers and the companies, and empowering workers to bring valuable information up through corporations so that they can help detect and mitigate against potential impacts. Kyle, I'm going to maybe just throw it to Kyle here too on the role of the investor, because I think groups like Kyle's and the investor mobilization that has occurred in this space has really also been a key driver in helping tick this up on the company radar.
Yeah, sure. I think just understanding the exposure and using tools that any investor may use on any other issue, and doing diligence on companies and understanding the exposure, the risk, the opportunities within an investment. Those same principles apply no matter what the issue is, and I think we're using those tools. And I think we can talk about some of the what the risk manifests, how the risk manifests in terms of company exposure, financial loss, et cetera. But those are real. We see this issue as a material risk to the companies, and we're valuing that way as we're looking at this, and we're seeing more investors do that. And the long-term investors are engaging with the companies to work through these issues. Others are divesting because of the issue, and I think you're seeing an increase in sophistication around the issue. And technology is helping definitely in getting that information to companies, to businesses, but also some investors are using some of the same data services, for example, on incidents of trafficking within or risk assessment of countries, for example, and understanding what that risk may translate to.
Great. Kyle, did you want to talk a little bit about the shareholder actions now then?
Sure. So, I think one thing that we are seeing is that, I look back over the year to see what type of shareholder engagement was going on around this issue, and there were 14 shareholder resolutions that were filed over the last year around trafficking and supply chains with public companies that I'm aware of. And the interesting thing for me is that 7 of those were related to responsible recruitment, investors asking very specific questions around reporting and policy. And so the sophistication, again, just showing the sophistication level around what to ask for from the investor community. And the trend, the conversations on the investor side as well have been, yes, disclosure is important, policies are important, but how do we really know, what are the practices, how do companies report on, the more than just the effort, but the effects, and how does this performance translate into shareholder value? So I think there's a rise on the investment side of kind of this understanding environmental, social, and governance issues related to your portfolio. There is much more work historically been done on the environmental side, and the social side has been a big gap. But what we're seeing is trafficking and forced labor is really kind of a tangible aspect of the social that investors feel like that can be measured. There are policies that are in place, and there's a long way to go around understanding and the data and measuring. But that we're paying attention to this. It's growing from investors that, I think, from the millennials standpoint, more women controlling wealth and resources over the next few decades. It will only be growing on the investor side in terms of the understanding and sophistication.
So Kyle just talked a little bit about the risks that shareholders, I think, can pose by pushing action. So maybe Tu and Shawn can talk a little bit about the different kinds of risks that companies face. I think someone mentioned legal and financial already, but if we could expand on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so at Marriott, one of the most obvious risks, and I think obvious for probably all of you, and that affects many of the companies in this room, is the reputational risk. This can become a huge public PR nightmare for any company that has global operations. And that's very, very clear. But we have to go and think beyond the reputational. And there are 4 other risks that we've identified in terms of how we communicate these types of issues inside our company. The second is security. And again, this is probably relevant for the oil and gas sector as well. Human trafficking poses security risks. When you have potentially criminal gangs or perpetrators who are committing illegal activities, leveraging or exploiting your resources, that becomes a huge security nightmare. And certainly for a hotel where these crimes may be potentially committed in, you have police cops and law enforcement rolling up into the hotel. Nobody wants that. The second is operational. When the law enforcement shows up, when the folks on the street start staring, when the media starts paying attention, it potentially shuts down business. So for hotels, we may be closed for business because there's a disruption in our operations. And that's just the sex trafficking. On the supply chain side, if there's any kind of issues in regards to procurement, where product cannot get to our facilities or hotels or where it's needed to go due to some kind of disruption around labor trafficking, where goods may be not be able to enter into the U.S. due to, like, let's say, the 1930 Tariff Act or for whatever reasons, that can disrupt our supply chain and our ability to operate. The last two is second to last is the legal risk. We are seeing an increasing regulatory landscape, particularly in the U.S., where there are laws being passed, both at the kind of municipality level, but also at the state level, requiring all kinds of signage or training for hotels mandated by the state. And so finally, what we're now also seeing is that there are legal, and due to the legal repercussions, there are financial penalties for these types of repercussions. And within some of these laws, we're seeing that hotels can be financially liable for not putting up a sign or providing human trafficking training, And the trend that we're seeing, which is not, which I think is going in the positive direction, is that victims are also being given the ability to sue companies. And so we have seen that play out more recently and much more specifically to hotels. So I would say at a minimum, there are 5 real risks that impact a company around human trafficking. But I'll hand it over to Shawn, who has worked with a number of companies around these things in terms of how to address them.
Great, thanks, too. Yeah, that's a great summary. I would really underscore the fact that the business environment is really changing. Not only are there the ongoing reputational risks and now increasing number of regulatory risks that are really spreading like wildfire around the world. The United Kingdom, Australia, France, Holland, a number of other countries now have more regulations around trafficking, about companies needing to be transparent about their due diligence processes. And in the wake of those, more and more procurement policies that specifically address the need to have a defined anti-trafficking plan in place. And obviously at the federal level here, we have our federal acquisition regulation. But in terms of business risks, now who a company is contracting with up and down their supply chain really matters to some of the examples I gave before. In the past, maybe people didn't give much thought beyond, is the price good? Are they able to deliver a quality good or service? And are they delivering it on time? Now you have to think, who is that person associated with? How are they bringing workers into a facility to make a product, to harvest a product, to mine a product, to do some sort of service? And are the practices associated with them going to come back and bounce back at me? And so as companies are increasingly figuring this out and looking at where their risks are, they have to be more careful stewards of their supply chain. And that is having strong ripple effects around how you choose which companies that you're buying from or that you're otherwise engaged with across the world, because these regulations tend to say what is your responsibility all the way to the bottom of the supply chain, all the way to the commodity level. And so I think in terms of showing other business partners that you're responsible, doing your due diligence to make sure that they're not posing a risk to you, it's a whole new ballgame now again. Sorry to bring up the baseball thing again, but a whole new ballgame because there are real different business consequences. And when the Customs and Border Protection Service can now stop your container because a good in there was made in whole or in part with forced labor, that has a real impact on the bottom line, even more than a front-page story in the New York Times.
And so my next question is about companies that have had to publicly grapple with something ending up on the front page of the New York Times. I know we talked about a couple of different industries, but if we could just do one, I think either Amy, Amol, or two can take this one and just run us through what's happened with one specific industry.
Okay, I'll talk about the electronics industry. So in 2014, several years ago, they received quite a bit of public scrutiny after Verite published a very public report saying that forced labor was widespread in the production of electronic goods in Malaysia by foreign migrant workers. That year, we took notice too, and in our annual Trafficking in Persons report, we placed the government of Malaysia in our lowest tier, essentially saying they weren't doing anything on this issue. So a business coalition, the Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition, they've since changed their name, but a coalition of more than 100 major companies, electronics companies, decided that they were going to make this an issue. They weighed in with the Malaysian government. They consulted the expert, Verite and ourselves. They developed a multitude of labor risk management tools. They enhanced auditing. They changed their code of conduct to prohibit the charging of recruitment fees. And they developed some grievance mechanisms for workers. And this coalition, fairly successful and was noticed, and now they have expanded and they're the Responsible Business Alliance. And so toy companies that have electronics in their supply chain and car companies that have electronics have joined, and they have quite a robust effort of risk management tools.
Okay, great. If we can talk a little bit more now at this point to tie it into the Signal case, because we are in a post-Hurricane Harvey context, like Mayor Turner mentioned in his opening comments, and we will hear from Mr. Ebiraju a little bit later. But if we could bring some of the things you've talked about so far and tie it into the Signal case, that'd be helpful. Anyone can take it.
So this is kind of an indirect connection, but I think that for oil and gas companies and for hotels, we actually share a really common supporting sector, which is construction. Marriott International doesn't own hotels. We don't even construct hotels. What we do is we brand them. But yet when a human rights issue is alleged in the construction of a hotel, who do you think they're going to go after? They're going to go after the name on the hotel, not the construction company that built the hotel. So we know that, from the comments from the panel, migrant labor issues and worker rights issues, these are one of the most vulnerable populations with regards to the construction sector. And I'm just going to pick a region. In the Middle East, this is prevalent, that workers from South Asia represent the majority of workers in the Middle East countries, particularly in the construction sector. They're building hotels, the new soccer stadium, all kinds of buildings, and maybe even your sites overseas. And we know that forced labor is very, very common in terms of migrant workers having to pay recruitment fees or high cost of visas, or in some countries like Qatar, where previously migrant workers were not allowed to change employers because their visa was attached to a very specific employer. So these are some of the things that if we weren't aware of these issues, I don't think as a company we would know what to ask for. So one of the things that at Marriott we're looking at is really looking at other sectors and industries and seeing how are they addressing this very complicating issue of recruitment fees and the vulnerabilities of migrant workers, particularly in industries that support our own. And so we had looked at the Consumer Goods Forum, which is for consumer products, but they had released what is called forced labor principles. As a result of this, the hospitality sector earlier this year in June essentially adapted these forced labor principles, which states three things. That the companies signing on to these principles commit to, one, not charging recruitment fees, two, not holding on to passports or any personal belongings of a worker, and that workers should not be forced or coerced to move and have the freedom of movement. Very, very basic principles, but yet powerful. And so it would be great, and I don't know what kind of development has been made in the oil and gas sector, but wouldn't that be amazing if, let's say, that particular sector created or adapted your own forced labor principles on these issues? So I think for these issues around forced labor and human trafficking, you heard from all of us, no industry is immune, and we can certainly look to one another to identify best practices, adapt them, share them across the board. But I think around migrant workers, this is one of the most vulnerable populations out there, and it's not just here in the U.S., but it's everywhere.
Shawn, did you want to talk a little bit about the visa violations?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to note with the Signal case, and obviously we'll be hearing from people directly involved in it in a little bit, but it's really emblematic of a lot of circumstances where you have guest worker visas, and most countries increasingly rely on foreign migrant workers. People from poor countries are going to other countries nearby or very far away to find work to support their family. And most countries have a fairly dysfunctional guest worker visa situation. I'll just speak frankly and say we certainly in the United States have a dysfunctional guest worker visa system. And so people brought in to deal with post-hurricane cleanup or to deal with the everyday harvesting of our crops or the everyday cleaning of our buildings or landscaping and so on. Even in this country, people are paying to get those visas, even though they're not supposed to be. They're then often, if they're not facing good conditions or not making the income that they were promised, find it very hard to leave those circumstances because the visas are tied to a particular employer. There's also a lot of fear of repercussions of being blacklisted, not being invited back, because for guest worker visas you have to apply every year, and so there's a lot of threat of being blacklisted by that employer or by the recruiter that helped you find that job. And the very real issue of violence or threats of violence, including being threatened against one's family, because in the age of the cell phone, it's very easy for recruiters and traffickers to know, or when they initially made contact with somebody in their home country, be it Thailand or India or Guatemala or wherever people are coming from, they have a way to know where people are from, and they use that knowledge and that ability to call up their associate back home and threaten somebody's wife or cousin or child or something. That fear and reality of harm is what keeps people trapped in a job. And so I think in the Signal case, and then in a lot of other circumstances with guest workers, those are the structural conditions that too often prevail across the world, but including here in this country.
Yeah, and Kyle, if you want to talk about the stuff maybe that we didn't hear about as much in the news after the Signal case, and also a little bit about your work with Transparentum.
Yeah, sure. So I think the story of Signal, again, we'll hear more, was devastating for those victims that were brought over for this work. And ultimately, the civil statutes, played out and allowed the victims to sue Signal International. And what I think is not often talked about is the secondary victims of this, which were retirees of Alabama. The Alabama retirement system owned 47% of Signal International and lost a reported $70 million in the bankruptcy of Signal International. So again, tying that real risk to shareholder value is just, I think Signal is a good but unfortunate example of that. Transparentum, so I'm on the board of Transparentum, which is a nonprofit that uses investigative journalism type reporting to go deep into complex supply chains to understand where there might be exploitation, take that information and create intelligence reports, and the team turns around and takes these intelligence reports to the companies, the ultimate buyers or retailers of goods that may be have forced labor in the chain, and so the idea is to not necessarily attack these companies, but to show them where they may be missing the mark on slavery and forced labor. And so the companies then have an opportunity to remediate and address these issues. A good example might be, the recruitment where there were fees paid by workers and the company was not aware of that. And so the remediation plan might look like, reimbursing those fees to those workers and addressing the suppliers or factories where this issue might be. Transparentum then takes that information, what the remedy is of the company, in addition to the reporting by Transparentum, and shares that with investors, with their board, with the media.
And the U.S. government. They also come in and show us their reports and videos.
And the company responses, in my mind, have been very positive. Taking it very seriously, and as I think we'll talk about in a bit, that's a very resource-intensive way to go deep into a supply chain, and that technology will really, advance both helping workers, helping companies understand the risks and exposures. But this is a good example of this is happening. There are a number of investigations going on right now. And again, this is from a nonprofit, philanthropic group that we support.
Great. Shawn, if you can talk about some of the clients that you do work for and some of the plans that you've come up or remediation type things that you've come up with for them to do.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad that Kyle mentioned the issue of returning fees to workers, because one of the compliance efforts that we are most proud of is the work that we've done with Apple globally to set aside specific policies and practices around labor recruitment with a strong commitment that any time it's found that a worker had to pay for a job, which, as everybody has been mentioning, is the typical mechanism for indebtedness and therefore debt bondage and trafficking, to institute that policy of returning fees. And the fact that it's required not only makes the migrant worker whole, because in the end, if that person has been in debt bondage, they should get their money back. It shouldn't just be a matter of, that was something bad happened and, we'll try to do our best not to have it happen again, but actually return the money not only is the right kind of remediation to happen and completes the circle, but it also really has led to much more active engagement by the suppliers. And with Apple, that means not just the companies around the world in places like Malaysia or Taiwan that are making the little bits. It's also the people that are maybe producing furniture at an Apple store, or the actual workers in Apple stores around the world, because again, so many retail facilities also rely on migrant workers. And so it's really interesting to see how once you require those suppliers to pay back the fees, that suddenly their policies and practices around how they hire workers change. And so that's something that we're particularly proud of. I'll just quickly give another example, because I know that healthcare is a really big industry here in Houston. I know it's all not just oil and gas. And we recently worked with a pharmaceutical association. A lot of times people think pharmaceuticals, where's the labor there? It's people in these high-tech facilities, probably with all sorts of protective equipment. It's an expensive product, but actually when you look at the chemical manufacturing facilities, as well as the fact that so many pharmaceutical manufacturing happens in a place like India and other developing countries, suddenly there are a lot of labor risks in addition to other kinds of services that they might face. And so I really just wanted to underscore that, sort of to the point that Amol was making before, that this is a problem that's solvable, and we've worked with companies to find ways. Of course, they haven't solved the problems altogether, but where there are some concrete things that can be done across lots of different sectors.
I think those are excellent examples. And then, too, if you talked a little bit about sex trafficking, of course, because Marriott is a hotel company, but if you can talk about your work with labor trafficking and supply chains, and maybe even a little bit about your work with Disney, I think they'd find it very interesting.
Sure. On the labor trafficking and kind of really looking at ethical recruitment, or the lack thereof, one of the things that Marriott has decided to do is we are actually in the process of updating our supplier conduct guidelines. These are that lay out the expectations for suppliers or vendors or business partners of Marriott. Currently, these guidelines are not public. However, what we hope to do is really enhance the language specifying no fees, that we do not charge recruitment fees as part of the application process, and we expect suppliers not to do the same. We're going to be looking at enhancing the human rights language much deeper as well, and hopefully by the end of the year, early next year, we'll be making these guidelines publicly available for the first time. The second thing we did, the first time in the company's history, is actually establish human rights goals related to supply chains. One, around awareness raising of associates and what to look out for on labor trafficking, so the indicators of labor trafficking, but also in the sourcing and procurement of products. Two, we're also looking, as I mentioned earlier, really how can we address or raise awareness of these types of issues in sectors that are supporting our industry, like construction. As you've heard from the panel, human trafficking is highly complicated, it is very overwhelming, and it's really interrelated. It's a very interconnected issue. And so in the US, one of the programs that we implemented with some success is called the Marriott Supplier Assessment Program. It's been around for 5 years, and basically this program focuses on furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So essentially everything in this room inside of a hotel. Hotels in the US must source and procure these types of products, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, from vetted suppliers and vendors that have gone through the assessment programs, where there are 3 tiers for success in terms of compliance. There are about, I would say, 150 or so suppliers, so it's not huge, but it is a requirement. So what we're trying to do is incentivize hotels to buy products from responsible businesses, as well as designers. And that's just one kind of program that we have around the supply chain. As Amol mentioned, and Verite, Shawn at Verite shared some great examples. We have also seen, not only on the Mehra side, but I've certainly seen great examples of solutions to address these issues. And at Disney, I was responsible for standing up a social innovation fund that allowed Disney to invest in programs that were innovative, that were new, or that needed to be scaled into different markets. And I'll give you 3 examples of potentially what you all could look at. One was actually a program with Verite to better understand ethical recruitment and the migration corridor between the Philippines and Japan. And the reasons why we chose the Philippines is it's a huge source market for foreign migrant workers who end up in lots of different industries around the world. And so really the purpose of that program was to, one, better understand what did workers learn? Did they get pre-departure training on what to look out for? How were they being recruited from country X to country Y? What types of information were they being provided, either at the source country or at the destination country? And what resulted was some really amazing tools created by Verite, where they created these educational videos to educate on both the receiving and the source and on the destination country to both workers on both sides of indicators and kind of what is ethical recruitment and what isn't ethical recruitment. The second program that Disney invested in was a program that focused on worker empowerment through worker voice. Disney was one of the first companies to invest in the Labor Link program, which basically leveraged mobile technology and took it to China to essentially to a scalable market. And scale is always a big issue for large multinational companies. If you don't have scale, then it's difficult to implement. So what Disney did was help Labor Link bring its tool to China in the manufacturing sector and work with factory workers to help them essentially on a reporting side of things. Is if they saw something to better understand the issue, if they saw anything that was out of place, provided them with a kind of a reporting mechanism or a grievance mechanism outside of management. The third is around actual solutions, and this is a really unique program that I still find remarkable, and it's implemented by Social Accountability International with the Rapid Results Institute, and it's called 10 Squared. And the purpose of this program is really to bring workers and management together to identify root causes of issues and then solutions and solve that problem within 100 days. This program had about a 97% success rate and engaged with over 30 different companies in Brazil to essentially find solutions to life-threatening situations where one particular factory had never instituted a fire evacuation procedure. So the first time they did it, it was like over a minute long to get everyone out of the factory. Within 100 days, working with workers, working with management, they got that down to, I want to say probably 45 seconds or something like that. It was dramatic. These are life-saving solutions that both of these parties that may have not necessarily communicated with one another came up together. So these are just some examples of how, one, by better understanding the issue, that can help lead to potentially solving something by providing reporting or a mechanism to report. And then, of course, direct worker management engagement has led to some real true success stories in some cases. So that's to say that for the companies in the room, this is a solvable issue, and business has a powerful and positive role to play in addressing human trafficking.
And Amol, do you want to talk a little bit about what they might see as they start to engage suppliers? I think we sort of sprinkled it throughout the conversation, and also about workplace WSR.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'll sort of veer from that question because I really like where two is going with this, because I think a lot of the conversation has been predicated around language of risk and about compliance. And that, I think, adopts a very de minimis perspective on looking at human trafficking and looking at the role that business has to play in addressing the scourge of modern slavery. So I think instead what I like is this notion of solutions and thinking about, at the end of the day, communities around the world that are impacted by modern slavery want equity, want fairness, and they want justice. And those are values that I think every one of us holds dear. So the question I think to each of us is, what are the solutions that you can innovate internally within your organizations? And one of the ones that I think has come up a lot is around procurement. Who are you buying from? What are you asking them to do? And then how are you using that leverage to reform your own supply chain? And the other piece, and this ties to the WSR bit, is around workers. Why are workers sort of treated as externalities in corporate supply chains when they are an integral part of all of the value creation that exists within supply chains? So is there a solution about engaging meaningfully with workers? And I think what's happening outside of that conversation about business as a solution and not just a slap on the wrist compliance model, but rather about like, where's value and can business create value in addressing these as well, is this movement that's being built around workers organizing themselves and claiming power within supply chains. And this is sort of the birth of worker collectives, but then also organizations like this new network called the Worker Social Responsibility Network that is doing some really innovative thinking and work around challenging the paradigm of CSR and sort of building enforceable agreements between workers and companies in a way that puts workers at the table. So I think all this to say, I think the horizon need not be bleak. Rather, it could be, really bright and hopeful. And I think it takes innovation, like Tu has been mentioning in her remarks, that we need to kind of double down on. And it takes leadership, like the city of Houston, by incentivizing responsible business. And I think that's sort of the path forward here.
Okay, great. Kyle, did you have a chance to talk about the screens as far as investments and the use of that screen that was developed?
So I think in terms of how we are activating our and aligning our investment portfolio, kind of back to the risk conversation for a bit. We are on our public equity, for example, portfolio. We are trying to understand and screen out companies that have public controversies of trafficking and forced labor. So when we came back from a trip in the Freedom Fund, actually, we asked our investment advisors, what type of exposure do we have to trafficking and forced labor? And it was really actually very hard to understand and know. And so we had investment advisors that found an asset manager who worked with the largest investment research firm in the world to do controversy research and provide that to the asset manager, and then to exclude those companies that were found in the last 3 years to have controversies and they did not have a remediation plan in place, to then remove those companies from our portfolio. And what started out as really value alignment for us and exposure, the asset manager asked if they could share that with their other clients as a screen. They manage, they have a number of screens, a dozen or so screens, and this was the first trafficking screen that they knew of. And so it ended up being their fastest growing screen in the history of the firm. And I think it's their second largest now. It's about 2.5 years old. And I think it's almost $1 billion now of assets being screened out related to trafficking. I think it's 950 the end of September. So again, I think it's an indicator. One for us, it's again about alignment, but an indicator of the greater interest. And then the activation on our portfolio on the private side has been more of understanding through due diligence questionnaires, private managers, private equity managers, and what exposures they might have in their companies and how they're managing to create value back on the value side. What might be left on the table in terms of value around this issue, and what can they do around adding, reputational reward or other areas, and then on a solutions focus from and we might talk about technology a bit. I think we really see value in the solutions, true investment returns on some of these solutions that can have uptake into companies. So we are an investor in a $25 million early stage venture fund that really stands on the shoulder of Tu and the work that she did at Disney, investing in technologies, emerging technologies, in areas such as worker voice, that are using mobile to give real-time data to dashboards for ultimate buyers of what's taking place in faraway places, in risk assessment tools, so understanding using mapping and other technology, traceability. We hear blockchain a lot, and I think that's something that we're seeing a lot of companies, nonprofits that are wanting to be more commercial, using blockchain to disrupt and provide solutions to chain of custody issues and verification issues. And then we're seeing ethical recruitment models, businesses that are offering solutions to the current model and setting up shop ethical businesses in some of these areas that are high prevalence, and putting investment dollars, capital into supporting those businesses to disrupt and support this issue.
Okay, so we have only about 5 or 10 minutes left, and so if we could talk a little bit about the responsible sourcing tool, and then maybe the tip report, Amy, and how it's used.
Sure. So the responsible sourcing tool that I mentioned before is a partnership between my organization, Verite, and the State Department's Trafficking in Persons Office, where following the promulgation of the federal acquisition regulation that's mandates that all federal contractors operating overseas have to have a compliance plan in place to stop the charging of recruitment fees, stop the confiscation of workers' identity documents, have fair housing, fair contracting, and so on. We created a model compliance set of compliance tools that help any kind of company, not just a federal contractor, but any kind of company grapple with how to build a full management systems approach to dealing with recruitment-related trafficking. And so on the responsible sourcing tool, you not only get a full set of tools around that, but also some tailored tools for the seafood sector, for example, and we're just about to release another set of tools tailored to the food and beverage sector. But also, the site has a suite of data sets that help you understand what are the particular risks across a wide variety of sectors, be they construction or electronics or seafood, more than 12 sectors, and then also reports on the link between more than 40 commodities and trafficking risk, and then also the factors in more than 100 countries that may help you better understand if you're sourcing or otherwise operating in a country, what may be the risks of trafficking in that country. So at the country level, commodity sector level, you get a full suite of information about where the risk to trafficking exists. But then on the practical, proactive side, there's a suite of tools that are based on concrete efforts of work that we've done with companies that represent essentially best practice in doing this. So it's all available for free for downloading on responsiblesourcingtool.org, thanks to the U.S. government.
And Amy, if you wanted to talk about the tip report.
So I mentioned in my introduction that our office produces the annual Trafficking in Persons report, and it's our signature report to engage foreign governments on this issue and help them guide their future work. The tip report covers 187 different countries, and we'd also like to think that it's a tool potentially that could be used by civil society and the private sector. In our introduction, we frequently cover the latest trends in human trafficking. We cover anti-trafficking heroes. We cover global law enforcement data and statistics on trafficking. But really, I think for business, if you're thinking about sourcing from a particular country, or if you want to stand up factories or build facilities, the country narratives have the latest, most up-to-date information on human trafficking in any country, as well as a foreign government's response to the issue. And I guess one of our favorite things is when companies and businesses sort of reach out to our office, want additional information, and ask us what sorts of messages can they bring when they are traveling abroad and engaging foreign government leaders. What messages will complement those that the U.S. government is giving? Because obviously we're so much more impactful if we are delivering similar messages when we're abroad.
And do you want to talk a little bit about the disclosure trends? We touched on it lightly as well.
Yeah, I think Shawn was mentioning it a little bit earlier, but there really has been an increasing emphasis on on disclosure and supply chain transparency. So, we have started sort of with California and the Transparency in the Supply Chain Act. We have the federal acquisition on ending trafficking in persons at the U.S. level, UK Modern Slavery Act, similar initiatives in Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, the Netherlands. I could go on. I'm missing several of them. You also have a lot of initiatives sort of at the multilateral level. So right now, through the Bali process, with its 45 member states, there is a government and business forum, and they just released a set of, they call them the AAA recommendations. So I think it's acknowledge, act, and advance. And they're really working to advance efforts in enhancing transparency in supply chains and due diligence and strengthening legislative policy frameworks. And I will say one last thing that's sort of exciting for us. So on the margins of the UN General Assembly this year, at a sort of a high-profile anti-trafficking event, the U.S. government, our Deputy Secretary John Sullivan, on behalf of the U.S. government, the UK government, the Australian government, the Canadian government, and the New Zealand government, released a set of core principles focused in 4 areas. One, enhancing procurement policies, because we know as these governments, we represent a lot of purchasing power. 2, the second one was to better engage and cooperate with the private sector and their efforts. 3, to enhance responsible recruitment. And 4, I think this might be music to some of your ears, really to better harmonize across jurisdictions, policies, and regulations. So we hear from business all the time that it's awfully hard if they have to do various reporting across different countries and their various regulations. So we're hoping to push these core principles out and get other governments to join the fold. We are having some listening sessions with different companies and civil society to hear what they think about them and how we can best implement them.
Great. Amol, can you tell us a little bit about your work with ICAR, and then we'll close with everybody's sort of ideas of what they'd like to see happen next.
Sure, this now feels like a throwback. This was my job before the job I have now, where I was the head of this organization that worked on essentially trying to get government to better regulate or incentivize responsible business conduct. So we were involved with the conflict minerals law, the Dodd-Frank Act, probably much to the chagrin of many of you in this room, but the point there was to say, can we look at the levers that government has, from buying through procurement to disclosure through securities laws and listing requirements to sort of more incentive structures and remedies? Can we look at that and unpack how government could better act in terms of its commitments under international law? And so we rolled that out in many different legal policy reforms. But it's something, this community of practice that I think is emerging. It's called this group is called Business and Human Rights, and it's really unpacking a set of principles that were developed at the United Nations called the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And that's kind of the genesis of this community of practice that is quickly emerging in the human rights sphere.
Great, thanks so much. So why don't we end now with everyone taking about a minute about what they'd like to see happen in the future, or for recommendations. Go ahead, Shawn. Yeah.
I would just double down on the policy example I gave before from Apple. Of now that most companies are looking at how they change their code of conduct and their contractual obligations around human trafficking, to insert the language that suppliers or other business partners are required to return fees that workers pay is a really concrete way to both sort of a carrot and stick to encourage the right kind of behavior around trafficking.
I guess mine will be, they say everything's bigger in Texas, right? So like, be bold in your ambitions. You're sitting at these major companies, and I think ask the questions about where are we buying from? Are we using our procurement systems internally as leverage? Are we asking our partners the right types of questions? The questions are out there. We just need businesses to start asking them and to really interrogate them. And then I think the next thing is, in the sort of concept of being bold and being big, is think about workers as not a externality, but as a key component of your business, and understand that value is created by engagement.
So I think for me, what I have found to be very effective, and I'm going to probably give 3 takeaways, is every one of us in this room can be better educated on what human trafficking is, whether it's sex trafficking or forced labor. So going out there and educate ourselves on the indicators, on understanding how these issues impact our business, so that we can all become champions inside our organizations on this. 2, now that we know what human trafficking is, raise awareness. Be that champion inside your company, whether it's identifying a policy that may be outdated and enhancing that language and adding human rights or ethical recruitment or no fees policy as part of that. That's something that you could probably do pretty immediately. And lastly, I think that you can't do any of this without partnership. So there's so many great organizations out there that work on these issues every single day. They are the experts. These are tough issues. We're not going to be able to find solutions for them immediately. But by working with external experts and organizations, it just leads us down the path of finding better solutions. So for me, we can always do everything better. So I'm challenging you all to do it better than Marriott.
Okay, great. I would say I would love to widen the circle of engaged companies. I feel like we work with some real business leaders, and the same companies are coming time and time again to the forums or hosting the forums. So I would love to sort of solicit some feedback as to how we can best bring into the fold and educate some of the smaller and medium enterprises, and look to see how, we've seen and we've mentioned a couple of sort of innovative business coalitions, whether it's the Responsible Business Alliance or Building Responsibly or the Seafood Task Force, that are doing some creative things, and they're more powerful because they're coming to the table as a block of companies and in a sort of a pre-competitive space. And I would love to see if some of those business coalitions could be replicated for some other industries that perhaps are not quite as far along, without naming anything.
Oh, go ahead.
I think I would just add, these are all great ideas, that being from Houston and knowing that when traveling and working and people say, the municipal response, there's nothing else like it, I would love to see the same from the business community, to say, yes, Houston was once known for a hub of human trafficking, and it's really a solution center, a group of companies, of business associations coming together, not being afraid, and stepping out there and really addressing this issue, and people knowing that it's coming from Houston, I think is what I'd love to see.
So clearly, being part of the mayor's office, we'd love to see that too. So I want to thank you all for being here. Today we have one special speaker left. We're going to invite J.J. Rosenbaum up from the Global Labor Justice, who's going to introduce Mr. Ebi Raju and Vinci Jacob.
Thank you, Minal and Mayor Turner, and to all of you for spending your evening here engaged on these important issues. I'm here as the U.S. Director of Global Labor Justice, which is an organization that grew from the very crisis-oriented Hurricane Katrina response more than 10 years ago through a national advocacy organization to now a global response that involves both movement building with worker organizations and migrant organizations, and also innovative strategy development about how we can work with worker organizations, migrant organizations, city, state, national and international governmental bodies, and also employer and supply chain stakeholders to really come up with innovative solutions along global supply chains, global value chains, and labor migration corridors. And I think as the panel has so thoughtfully discussed today, we need corporate leaders to come up with the best internal policies, and I think there's a lot of richness that was discussed here today. That's also going to have to be combined with engagement with worker and migrant organizations. In any level of a supply chain where there's a robust engagement with collective workers, whether it's a trade union, a worker organization, a migrant organization, you're not going to find human trafficking there. And so we have to think creatively about what this looks like as we have global supply chains and so much transnational work, but that's fundamental. And then finally, as has been touched on a lot here, we see migration issues really fundamentally playing into many of these issues. And as we sit here within a few days of the shooting at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, in part because they were reaching out to refugee and immigrant families, I think we're all called at all of the layers of our leadership to really think about the migration issues within our supply chains. I know, in speaking with many workers, that they've told me in the last year that they feel, even workers regardless of their immigration status that are perceived as being migrants, feel pressures in the workplace that they haven't felt before. And that matters at the level of law, but also at the level of culture change. And I think Texas is a place that has always been a diverse city that has drawn from the strength of that diversity. So I'm really hopeful that the leaders of your sectors in Texas have a lot to teach us in this area. So it's my honor to introduce tonight a friend and colleague of more than 10 years, Ebi Raju, who I met in 2007 when he came as a guest worker to work at Signal International here in Orange, Texas. And for those of you who don't know, he's part of a group of 500 workers from South India that paid more than $20,000 for the promise to come and be an expert worker in his field in the oil and gas industry, to live with his family, which all of us want to do, and to do good work in a good sector and a good place, which he heard about in India. And it turned out that, in fact, what was promised was a short-term job tied to one employer, where instead of bringing out the best, there was a lot of fraud. And when the workers tried to come forward and say, hey, this is not the deal that we were promised, this is not what we paid $20,000 for, there was aggressive retaliation by the company. And so I think what we're talking about today is exactly the opposite of that kind of response. The good news is that 10 years later, Ebi is a welding inspector here in Texas. He has more than 20 years experience in the field, and he lives here with his 2 boys and is a proud Houstonian and proud member of the Texas oil and gas community. He's going to talk today about solutions from the worker experience and from his lived experience, which I think will add richly to the conversation before us. Also, he's going to speak in Malayalam, and translating for him will be Bincy Jacob, who is another important part of the Houston community here. She has 2 decades worth of experience working with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and turning that into a positive, proactive vision for labor rights and immigrant rights.
Good evening. എൻ്റെ പേര് എബി രാജു എന്നാണ്.
My name is Ebi Raju.
2006 ഏകദേശം 500ഓളം ഗസ്റ്റ് വർക്കർ ഇവിടെ വന്നതിനകത്തുള്ള ഒരു ഗസ്റ്റ് വർക്കറാണ് ഞാൻ.
I am one of about 500 guest workers that arrived here in 2006.
ഞാൻ ഇന്നിവിടെ ഷെയർ ചെയ്യാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നത് ഈ രാജ്യത്ത് തന്നെ ഒട്ടുമിക്ക സ്റ്റേറ്റുകളിലും അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ പല രാജ്യങ്ങളിലും ഞാൻ ഈ ഗസ്റ്റ് വർക്കർ പ്രോഗ്രാം എന്നതിലൂടെ എനിക്കുണ്ടായ അനുഭവങ്ങൾ നിങ്ങളോട് ഷെയർ ചെയ്യാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നു.
I'm here to speak a little bit from the experiences I've had as a guest worker in many countries around the world, as well as the majority of the states in this country that I've worked in.
ഇത് ഈ ഒരു ഗസ്റ്റ് വർക്കർ പ്രോഗ്രാമിൻ്റെ അകത്തുള്ള ഈ ചൂഷണം സത്യത്തിൽ ആരംഭിക്കുന്നത് അതിൻ്റെ ആ റിക്രൂട്ട്മെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ ആദ്യ ഘട്ടത്തിൽ തന്നെ തുടങ്ങുകയാണ്. വളരെ തെറ്റായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രോമിസുകൾ കൊടുത്തുകൊണ്ട് വലിയൊരു ഹ്യൂജ് എമൗണ്ട് വാങ്ങുന്നതിലൂടെ.
The exploitation the guest workers experience start from the very beginning, which is with the recruitment stage, with the false promises, and they collect a lot of money based on those promises.
അത് പിന്നെ കണ്ടിന്യൂ ആയിട്ട് ഈ രാജ്യത്ത് വന്നതിന് ശേഷവും ആ ജോബ് സ്ഥലത്തും അത് അങ്ങനെ തന്നെ തുടരുകയാണ് പല രീതിയിലൂടെ തന്നെ.
And so in many ways that continues to be perpetuated once we arrive here in this country at the job sites.
ഈ ഗസ്റ്റ് വർക്കർ സിസ്റ്റത്തിലൂടെ അതേപോലെ തന്നെ എമിഗ്രേഷൻ്റെ പ്രോബ്ലവും ഇങ്ങനെ പല രീതിയിലുള്ള ചൂഷണങ്ങൾ അവർക്ക് അനുഭവപ്പെടേണ്ടി വന്നാൽ തന്നെ അവർക്ക് മുന്നോട്ട് ചെന്ന് റിപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്യാൻ അവർക്ക് പേടിയാണ്. എമിഗ്രേഷൻ്റെ പ്രോബ്ലം അതേപോലെ തന്നെ ഈ എംപ്ലോയറുടെ സൈഡിൽ നിന്നുള്ള റിട്ടാലിയേഷൻ മൂലം.
When guest workers experience these exploitations and bad situations, they don't have any recourse to report it, partially due to immigration issues, partially due to the employment tie-up issues.
ഇത് ഒരുപക്ഷെ നമുക്കിത് പല രീതിയിലും നമുക്കിതിനെ അവോയ്ഡ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും. ഒരു മോണിറ്ററിങ് ഗവൺമെൻറ് ഒരു ഒഫീഷ്യലിൻ്റെ ഒരു മോണിറ്ററിങ്ങോ കാര്യങ്ങളോ ഇതിൻ്റെ ആദ്യ സ്റ്റേജ് തൊട്ടുള്ള ഈ റിക്രൂട്ട്മെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ മുതൽ അവരുടെ വർക്ക് പ്ലേസിലുണ്ടാകുന്ന ബാഡായിട്ടുള്ള സിറ്റുവേഷൻ എല്ലാം മോണിറ്റർ ചെയ്യാൻ പീരിയോഡിക്കായിട്ട് മോണിറ്റർ ചെയ്യാനായിട്ട് ഒരു സിസ്റ്റം ഉണ്ടെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഒരുപക്ഷെ നമുക്ക് ഈ ഒരു സാഹചര്യത്തിൽ നിന്ന് ഇവരെ കരകയറ്റാനും കമ്പനിയെയും അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ എംപ്ലോയീസിനെയും നമുക്ക് സേവ് ചെയ്യാനായിട്ട് സാധിക്കും.
So I believe that there are ways to avoid this from happening, to save not just the employee, but also to save the company if we have some kind of monitoring system, whether by government or other way, to monitor from the recruitment phase all the way through the work that's happening over here.
ഇന്നെനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നത് വളരെ നല്ലൊരു സംഭവമായിട്ട് തോന്നുന്ന കാര്യം ഞാൻ ചോദിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ സിറ്റി ഓഫ് ഹ്യൂസ്റ്റൺ ഇന്ന് ഈ ഇവൻ്റ് നടത്തുന്നതിലൂടെ തന്നെ ഈ കമ്പനികൾക്ക് കൊടുക്കാൻ ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്ന അവർ കൊടുക്കുന്ന ഈ ഗൈഡ് ലൈൻ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഈ ആൾക്കാരെ ഈ ചൂഷണത്തിൽ നിന്ന് വിടുവിക്കാനും അതോടൊപ്പം ഈ മുന്നോട്ട് ഭാവിയിൽ ഈ വരുന്ന പുതിയ ഗസ്റ്റ് വർക്കർ പ്രോഗ്രാമിലൂടെ വരുന്ന ആൾക്കാരെയും അതേപോലെ തന്നെ കമ്പനികളെയും കൂടുതൽ നല്ല രീതിയിലേക്ക് അവരുടെ വിജയത്തിലേക്ക് അവരെ കൊണ്ടുപോകാനായിട്ടും ഈ സ്റ്റെപ്പ് ഉപകരിക്കും എന്ന് ഞാൻ വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നു.
I think this is a very good step that the city of Houston is taking to have this kind of meeting, not only to give guidelines on how to save people who are currently experiencing trafficking, but to create new guidelines and new rules that will avoid people from being trafficked in the future.
ഇത് എനിക്ക് ഈ അവസരം നിങ്ങളോട് പറയാനായിട്ട് തന്ന എല്ലാവരോടും നന്ദി പറയുന്നു. അതേപോലെ തന്നെ മുന്നോട്ട് ഈ പ്രോഗ്രാം മറ്റുള്ള സ്ഥലത്തുള്ള സിറ്റികളിലും എല്ലായിടത്തും ഇതൊരു കൂടുതൽ പ്രേരണയായി തീരട്ടെ എന്ന് ഞാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നു.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to come and speak to all of you today, and I hope that this becomes a role model for other cities around this world, that it would become an encouragement for them to do something like this.
Thank you.
So that concludes our program for tonight. There is a reception right out these doors. The panelists, Mr. Raju, and all of us will be there. So thank you so much for making the time. We know your time is valuable, and we'll see you outside. Plenty of time to ask them questions.